All right, so I'd like to first acknowledge the organizing team. So we have Guyu, who's on the line today, Patricia from the BC Assembly of First Nations. Sorry, I should mention Guyu's from FNESS. Joanna, who's our tech expert and guru with the BC Assembly of First Nations. Annette and Dara, thanks for all their communication support. And so I'd just like to give a brief overview of the agenda and the speakers. So after I kind of finish this welcome and housekeeping, I'm going to pass it over to retired Chief Harvey McLeod from Upper Nicola Band, followed by a presentation from Amanda Laglace from the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, followed by Nina Nichols from the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. And then we'll have Carmichael Howes and Guyu Lin from the First Nations Emergency Services Society, or FNESS. And to finish us off, we'll have a presentation from Cynthia Fell from the Tŝilhqot'in National Government, followed by a question and answer and discussion. So please, we'll leave the questions and discussion for the end. If you have any questions that come up, just pop them in the chat. We'll be monitoring those, and we really appreciate we'll appreciate your questions and look forward to the discussion. So just a bit of virtual housekeeping. If you don't mind renaming yourself with your organization and name if you'd like. If you wanted to keep your camera on during the discussion, that would be great. If you could mute yourself during the presentations and just use the raise hand function, which is at the bottom of the screen, and the chat function as well. If you have any tech issues, you can message us in the chat or text or call Joanna Prince. She's our BCAFN, as I mentioned, the tech support. Her number's there. There is closed captions as well. If you see at the bottom of your screen, it says closed captions. The webinar is being recorded. And also just take care of yourself during the webinar. If you need to get up and stretch, or if, it's a tough topic sometimes discussing climate change and the projections and scenarios. So take care of yourself. And without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce, former Chief Harvey McLeod from Upper Nicola Band, and he's also a BCAFN board member. He has a lot of expertise and wisdom to share. He recently went to COP27 in Egypt. I guess that was in the fall, and I'd like to pass it over to Harvey McLeod for some opening remarks and to start us off in a good way.
And in the language that translates into good day, my friends and relatives, like mentioned, I was the chief for Upper Nicola Band, part of the Okanagan Nation, and a chief for 9 years, and a council member, a councillor for 22, so 31 years of my life has been in leadership for our community. And before I go and start, I'd just like to open us up in a good way. Tŝilhqot'in Creator, many blessings and thanks for this day, for this morning, for this circle, for this gathering, for allowing us to come and share, learn, understand where we're at and how we move forward together as people. Our Tumula, our Tamiu needs our services, our kindness, our hand to bring some awareness and health back to the lands that we live on. Tŝilhqot'in, we ask that you take care of us during this session, during this day, as we talk about our world. And let's have a really good session. White Limited, thank you. As I mentioned, it's been a challenging 9 years, more so 3 years in our leadership. Not only leadership, but our people, our community, our nations, in what we've experienced in our worlds, individually and families. a few years ago, I didn't know what an atmospheric river was. I haven't experienced or seen towns burning down, tons of and thousands of acres of land burnt. And of course, the revelation about that started with the 215 in Kamloops. All of that impacting us. And we as people, knowing that there was change, not only change because of the 215, but change in our little world of ours. Some of us looked at what was happening with the mountain pine beetle, for example, and us having to go and clear cut thousands of acres of land to salvage the trees that were being devastated by the mountain pine beetle. And our people wondering, why are you doing that? Why? We don't do that. We don't clear cut. And then noticing that things like the geese weren't going south anymore. The swans, they were staying home. They were staying here all year round. And that was strange. That has never happened before. Going through a heat dome where we're reaching the mid 40s to upper 40s in temperature. And at the same time, looking at minus 40 to minus 50 degrees weather. And looking at our environment, our world of ours, just for example, what I've experienced is that mosquitoes have changed. Now we call them no-see-ums, and their bite is worse than a mosquito. But I'm noticing that there's less mosquitoes and more no-see-ums around. I've noticed that there's a change in the plant life. For example, here in my little yard here, I have burdock that would normally grow about a foot on a good year. Now they're up 5-6 feet. So I'm saying, what is going on with our world? And being a leader and involved in the political arenas, dealing with land, housing, education, et cetera, didn't really stop and have a look at what was happening with the environment, other than the trees, and trying to understand what's going on here. And going to COP27 in Egypt in late November, mid-November, was a real eye-opener, and seeing that what we were experiencing here was happening in other countries around the world, and all dealing with it, mainly in the same sphere, looking at how can we reduce the pollutants that we're putting into our environment, and what can we do differently to live as people to reduce the not needed things we want in life. And looking at and talking about the environment, and having them discussions with other leaders from around the world gave me a realization, hey, this isn't only happening in Upper Nicola, in Colchana, the Nicola Valley. This is worldwide and needs our attention. How can we get the attention of the people of the world to say, let's stop, have a look, what are we doing? What's the history? What can we do now? And make new plans for tomorrow. And how can we do that work without having, at the same time, dealing with the impacts, the floods? Our people in our communities are still recovering and still rebuilding from the floods, or looking for new lands that were taken away because of the floods, or taken away because of the fires. So we have a lot of leaders working to recover, but at the same time, wanting to bring attention to where we're at and have some understanding about where we're at and how we're going to move forward. What can we do today to change tomorrow? And as a chief of Milcom, I started doing some of that work and having a better understanding about what was happening up there, and what can we do different here? What can we do different at Upper Nicola? And we started looking at carbon, and understanding carbon, not understanding the science or the technology that goes with carbon capture, but at least knowing that there's something that we can do as people, as community, to reduce the emissions that are going out into the atmosphere. And a little better understanding amongst community, having discussions in community about what's going on, and have them have the freedom and the confidence to talk about what's going on, because I know that as people, we have a lot to offer based on our own traditions, our own upbringing, and our own understanding about the environment and the world that we live in. So bringing that change, bringing that understanding, bringing that discussion together as people is what we are looking forward to doing right now. And I'm really happy that our team has been able to facilitate, and you join us today to see and understand and find a way on how we can work cooperatively to engage and do something to clean up around us. And as chief for Upper Nicola, have engaged with tribal leader Fawn Sharp, for example, tribal leader Quinault, also the president of the Congress of American Indians, and looking at what they're doing, what they're talking about, what they're understanding, and seeing that it's the same up here. The legislation that guides them is pretty much the same as well. And there are opportunities for us to get involved and engaged in correcting the environment. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invite, and let's have some really good discussions. And it's good to see and be with you again. So with that, White Limerick, thank you.
Thank you so much, Harvey, for your words and wisdom, and for just starting this webinar off in a good way. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Amanda Laglace from the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. If she's just going to share her screen and start the presentation. Thanks so much, Amanda.
Gonna turn my microphone on too. If you guys can just let me know if you can see my screen, that would be great. It'll be shifting into presentation mode.
Looks good, Amanda.
Perfect, thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Amanda, and I'm happy to be here with all of you. Today I will be discussing climate scenarios, risks, and highlighting the importance of the 1.5 degree target. So before we get started, I just thought I would share a little bit about myself. I joined the Canadian Centre for Climate Services as a physical science officer in the fall of 2021. I work on the support desk where I help people find, understand climate data and information. I am calling in today from Halifax, Nova Scotia, located in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So climate change is closely connected to colonialism. Indigenous peoples have been resilient to changes imposed by colonialism for hundreds of years. The 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, their report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability recognized that colonial is a historic and ongoing driver of the climate crisis, which has increased both the effects of climate change and the vulnerability of specific people and places. Indigenous peoples have a wealth of knowledge and skills when it comes to ecosystem stewardship and resilience in the face of changing conditions. Climate change may place an increasing burden on Indigenous communities already impacted by colonialism through the loss of biodiversity and environmental degradation, which is likely to increase the work required to continue being resilient. So recent climate events have highlighted the need to prepare for a climate that is considerably different from the past. The most recent IPCC report highlights that every increment, even small increases in global warming, escalates the impacts, and that adaptation will become more difficult. Western science climate models project a range of possible future pathways at the global, Canadian, and regional levels based on low to high greenhouse gas emissions. The climate data and information from these models can then be used to support mitigation and adaptation action and planning. So our presentation today will touch on these and draws on three key reports from the IPCC. The 2018 special report on the impacts of 1.5 degrees, the sixth assessment report on the physical basis or Western climate science from August 2021, and the recent synthesis report that was actually released just last month. These reports also underscore that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and issues an urgent call to action. It notes that vulnerable communities who have historically contributed the least to climate change are unfortunately disproportionately being affected. So the IPCC's sixth assessment report is unequivocal that warming of the climate is due to human influence, and only with urgent and deep reductions can we limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. So here you can see some of the projected changes to temperature and precipitation under the 1.5, 2, and 4 degrees of warming. The degree of warming will not be the same everywhere. From this figure and other reports, we do know that Canada is warming faster than the global average, which is likely to continue. Further, some places might see an increase in precipitation and others may see a decrease, as shown in these graphs here. I'd also like to highlight that these types of figures don't tell us the whole picture. For example, these precipitation graphs don't tell us information about extremes like downpours. They kind of just take a snapshot of that general projected trend. So the most recent report from the IPCC shows that risks and projected adverse impacts escalates with every increment of global warming and will occur at lower levels of warming than previously assessed. So the figure shown here illustrates how different global choices in greenhouse gas emissions will lead to different amounts of global warming, from very low to very high. The lines represent the different range of emission scenarios. For example, the red line represents a high emission scenario and our dark blue line shows a low scenario. The lines themselves represent the median or average from the models, while the shading shown for the high and low scenario represent the range of possibilities. And then the gray shading in this part here represents the climate of the recent past, or the climate that elders would be familiar with. I'd also like to note that 1.1 degrees of warming has already occurred, as shown by our gray line here at the bottom. So there's a lot of information on this slide. I am going to highlight some interesting points. First, this graphic here on the left is the same graphic that we just saw on previous slide, and it ties into our graphic shown here on the right side. I've added a yellow line just to emphasize 1.5 degrees of warming, and we can see what that means to different kinds of impacts, or what the IPCC calls global reasons for concern. So 2 bars are shown for each of the 5 areas of concern. It's important to focus on the wider bars because they come from the most recent assessment. And the IPCC calls these bars burning embers, and they are used to show the level of risk for each area of concern, and the color change from white to yellow to red to purple shows how that risk is changing. For example, for the first area of concern, unique and threatened systems, the moderate risk, or yellow, has already changed to red at about 1.1 degrees of warming. This shows a high risk or potential for adverse consequences. And this reason for concern refers to human and ecological systems, such as like the Arctic, mountain glaciers, and biodiversity hotspots. And at 1.5 degrees of warming, the risk shifts from red to purple into very high risk. So next is the extreme weather events, in which events like heat waves, heavy rain, drought, wildfire, and coastal flooding impact human health, livelihoods, and ecosystems. And here you can see that the risk does not shift quite as quickly. At 1.1 degrees, the shift from moderate to high is just starting. And then at 1.5, the risk is high, and then it shifts to very high at about 2 degrees. So the IPCC has also assessed risks to land-based and ocean and coastal ecosystems, again, still using the burning ember bars. Here we want to highlight 3 areas of risk, paying attention to the yellow line showing 1.5 degrees of warming. So the risk of wildfire damage shifts from moderate to high, or yellow to red, at about 1.5 degrees. Remember that this is a global aggregated risk, so it's not speaking to a specific risk at the community level, but it's showing an overall trend direction. Biodiversity loss is similar. Here you can see that that shift is very high risk from yellow to red to dark red, and it shifts rapidly as warming increases from very high risk, or the purple color, occurring at about 2 degrees. And then lastly, looking at kelp forests under the ocean and coastal ecosystems, from 1.5 to 2 degrees, the risk has been defined as moderate. However, it does start shifting to red or high risk at about just before 2 degrees, and to very high risk just after 3. If you are interested in these kinds of aggregated risk assessments, there are more in the synthesis report as well as the physical science report, including examples and risks for bivalves. So looking at projected temperature change in Canada, it is important to note first that Canada has warmed at about 2 times the global rate. So 1.5 degrees of warming globally translates to about 3 degrees for Canada. However, warming in Canada itself is not uniform. Regions across Canada will feel the impacts differently. For example, Northern Canada has warmed about 3 times the global rate, and these different types of warming are expected to continue. This trend also holds true across our emission scenarios, as seen in these figures here. Here, they're shown here is a low emission scenario, which is roughly equivalent to the Paris Agreement of just under 2 degrees of global warming by the end of the century. And then the high emissions scenario on the right has quite a bit more warming, just over 4 degrees of change. In considering what kind of impacts we can anticipate with different amounts of warming, we can learn from experience, because climate change is already here today. We just may experience it a little more or a little less often in the future. While a single event cannot be attributed entirely to climate change, there are specialized climate scientists who work to figure out the climate change signal for extreme weather events and how likely those events are. For example, for the British Columbia heat dome, the attribution specialists found that in the past climate, this type of event would have had a 1 in 150,000 chance of occurring, so a fairly extremely rare event. However, in today's climate, the heat dome has about a 1 in 1,000 chance of occurring, so still a rare event. However, should we reach 2 degrees of warming, a similar event could happen on a 1 in 5 or a 1 in 10 year basis. So as we know, the international community is working to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. There are a range of plausible futures depending on the emission choices made by the global community. It is important to be prepared for different futures in the event the 1.5 or the 2-degree pathways are not met. Adapting to climate change means planning for the increased risks that a range of possible futures may bring. From a risk assessment perspective, that means considering a range of plausible futures and therefore a range of emission scenarios. In addition to thinking about how best to achieve a low emission scenario, as shown by the blue line and shading here, we recommend also still considering medium and high emission scenarios and their associated risks, which are shown by the yellow and red sections. Considering a range of scenarios allows us to evaluate how tolerant or vulnerable our infrastructure, communities, and ecosystems are, and it enables us to be better prepared for a range of possible futures. So this figure here shows the projected change in temperature for Canada and the globe for all 3 emission scenarios by the end of the century. And from that, you can see how different temperature could end up being, depending on what scenario we end up finding ourselves in. The main takeaway here is that it's important to consider a range of plausible futures in order to be best prepared. Western science can be used to complement Indigenous knowledge to inform adaptation and to prepare for a future impacted by climate change. So lastly, the Canadian Centre for Climate Services can help users find and access climate information and data, as well as direct clients to relevant resources. Our website provides access and links to other platforms and resources as well, including the Climate Atlas of Canada, climatedata.ca, and PAVIX. Climate Atlas is a very good starting point. It has easily accessible data that combines climate science mapping and storytelling, and also includes an Indigenous perspective. Climatedata.ca is a great resource for those looking for higher resolution climate data, or those that wish to explore climate data in more detail and perhaps even undertake their own climate analyses. And then PAVIX is geared towards those power users who really like to get their hands on lots of data and would probably be useful for people who do have some coding experience as well. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today to all of you. If you do ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact our support desk. Either myself or one of my colleagues is always happy to help.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for your presentation. It's very informative. And now I'll turn it over to Nina Nichols from the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium to present. If you could share your screen, Nina.
Okay, here we go. Which screen are you seeing?
You got to swap it.
Okay. Is that it?
Perfect. Looks
Okay.
great.
Great. Okay. Let's do it. Okay. So thanks everybody for inviting, or Christy and BCAFN for inviting me. I'm excited to speak. My name is Nina Nichols. I'm a settler of Egyptian, Lebanese, and British descent, calling from beautiful Lekwungen territory, Esquimalt, and the Salish nations. Today I'll be presenting on climate change projections in BC, so following up a bit, zooming in a bit from Amanda's presentation. So I work for the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, or PCIC, which is a regional climate service provider. So much of our staff focuses on climate research, modeling, and downscaling climate data. So that means translating those global climate models that Amanda was talking about into smaller spatial scales, so down to a 10-kilometer by 6-kilometer grid using observational and local data sets. So this allows climate data to be more easily used by regional and local decision makers. And my role at PKIC is in that in-between space, so to support people in using the data. So in particular, I was hired to support PKIC's capacity to collaborate and support First Nations communities in utilizing and accessing climate data. And so although my presentation is very Western science focused, I do want to start by highlighting that climate data based in Western science is only one way of knowing. So climate data can support planning and decision making by providing quantitative information and that long-term analysis of where we may see changes in our climate. But other forms of knowledge are necessary to really paint a complete picture of the climate, such as Indigenous knowledge or local and land-based monitoring efforts, because the more forms of knowledge we bring forward, the better and clearer the picture we paint of the future can be. So ultimately, it's another tool in the toolbox to address concerns and changes. Climate data may not always be applicable for all projects, but there might be some where it is useful. So when I'm talking about climate change, I'm talking about the change in average conditions over long periods of time. So generally, scientists use 30 years of data to determine a trend. And climate change is also the change in climate-related extreme events with different intensity and frequency. So for example, increases in the number of droughts or heavy precipitation. And both of these types of changes are linked. So a location may have less precipitation throughout the whole year, but may see more extreme events with heavy rainfall, which can cause more damage. So now most things about the future are uncertain, and climate models are no different because we can't predict the social, technological, and political choices of the future, which will impact how much greenhouse gases we emit and ultimately how much the climate will change. So scientists use different emission scenarios, which Amanda touched on, to show that range of possible futures. So in recent modeling, SSPs, or shared socioeconomic pathways, have been used to model these possible futures. So SSPs include 5 pathways on the left here that illustrate different ways in which global societies may develop, and each of those includes an amount of greenhouse gas emissions and a projected warming. So on the right here, we see 3 of these scenarios projecting out for future temperature in BC compared to a 1971 to 2000 baseline. And it's worth pointing out that this baseline is different than the one the IPCC uses. It's a more recent baseline. So now looking at these different emission scenarios, so SSP5, which is right here in red, is a high emission scenario. So it has assumptions around an energy intensive or fossil fuel based economy. And there's around 6.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century in this scenario. SSP2 is a middle of the road scenario. So it's a mix of fossil fuel and renewables. And it has about 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And SSP1, right in this corner here, represents a pathway with a really big societal shift to renewables and reduced emissions. So it's a low emissions future with around 2.3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And this low emission scenario here most closely matches up with the commitments of the Paris Climate Agreement to reach 1.5 degrees of global warming. However, because BC is warming twice as fast as the global average, when global warming reaches that 1.5 degrees of warming, in BC, our average temperature change will be greater than that 1.5 degrees. So you can see that in the graph, because even this low emission scenario is exceeding 1.5 degrees. And so I wanted to take a moment to talk about how hard it is to wrap our minds around the scale of change we're talking about, because a couple of degrees isn't a big deal when we talk about weather. But when we're talking about the climate, every degree of change is significant because scientists average over a whole year and over a region. So it takes a lot to make even a degree of difference. And so if you imagine that every day was normal, but you had 10 degrees above normal for 30 days in a row, that would be a really big deal and a super long heat wave. But that would only be about a degree above normal because all of the other days average it out. So that's just something to think about to really hone in that every degree is a significant change. And under any of these emission scenarios, the future is going to be a lot warmer than today. And like Amanda said, that range of potential future conditions is also going to be a lot larger. So pushing for mitigation and low emissions is extremely important to keep us on this lower end of warming and reduce those impacts. So I'm going to shift gears a bit to talk about projections in BC. So in general, we can expect warmer winters, hotter, drier summers, wetter winters and shoulder seasons, and an increase in frequency and severity of precipitation and storm events. So remembering variability, these changes won't always happen consistently over time or across regions, as natural seasonal and yearly variations will still occur. So starting with looking at hot days in the lower mainland. So hot days are the number of days above 30 degrees Celsius. Here on the left, we have the historical average. So that's that 1971 to 2000 baseline. And on the right here, we have a future projected scenario. So that's looking at a high emission scenario out to the middle of the century. So we can see that that historical average shows mostly 0 days above 30 for most of the area. Whereas that future scenario, on average, there's about a whole month of hot days for this region. So this is quite significant because this is only average summers. So hot summers will be even hotter than this. So thinking about this, how is this going to impact ecosystems, health, and many other things, and thinking about how we can prepare for these types of changes. Now staying in Metro Vancouver, but looking at precipitation. So we can see an annual modest increase of about 11% to the 2080s. But most of that precipitation falls in the already wet seasons, so in fall and winter, with 20% change in the fall and a 14% change in the winter. And then noticing that summers are actually going to see a decrease in precipitation by about minus 29% in the summer. So this can contribute to more frequent flooding as longer drought dries the soil and reduces its capacity to accept water. So drought followed by extreme rain or even modest rain can lead to more overland flooding. And this trend is really consistent across most of the province, with the exception of the Northeast, which actually does see a modest increase in summer precipitation. Now looking at the Okanagan area, looking at tropical nights. So tropical nights describes the number of days where the nighttime low temperature is warmer than 20 degrees Celsius. So looking at the past, we can see there was pretty much 0 days. But looking at the future, especially in those low elevation areas, we can see these areas might start to experience about 15 to 20 such nights on average. So this is important because summer days and heat waves can become particularly stressful if overnight temperatures don't provide cooling relief to allow the body to recover or other various ecosystems to recover. Okay, now looking at ice days and snow in the terrace region. So ice days are days when daytime temperature stays below 0 degrees. So in the past, we can see around 75 days on average. And looking at that high emission scenario to the end of the century, we see around 28 days. So this is from around 2.5 months to less than 1 month of ice days in the region. So this could affect ecosystems, pest distribution, agriculture, and all sorts of things. And then additionally, because of those higher winter temperatures, terrace and the surrounding region can expect warmer seasons, which will cause more precipitation to fall as rain rather than snow. So by the 2050s, there's a decrease of about 50% of snow. And then by the 2080s, a decrease of about 66% by the end of the century. So this is, again, a really big shift, and adaptation measures can support communities to prepare for the changes that are to come in the long term. So using climate data like the slides that I just walked through can be really helpful as a starting point to discuss hazards, impacts, or risks. So focusing on that trend, or focusing on the trend of the data alone, can tell us a lot about what we can expect and support conversations around preparedness and priorities. The data alone doesn't answer any questions, but it's really best practice to integrate it within other conversations or processes. So maybe that is emergency response planning or community adaptation plans or looking at different food security initiatives. So applying climate data to these ongoing conversations can really inform preparedness and decision making. And so one example is here from Up North on Climate, who did adaptation planning with northern communities in Ontario. And I like this example because it really shows that climate change as a starting point. So what they've done is they've found the climate change indicators related to drought and dry periods. And then from there, discussed what are those impacts on the land, what are the impacts on the communities. And then in this lower part of the image is where they've determined different adaptation measures. So monitoring for drought conditions, sharing about water conservation. So these are the adaptation measures. And something like this can just be really helpful for at the community level for understanding risks and preparing for future changes. And there's some nice art there too, which is always a plus. So my final slide, so all of these projections that I've talked about and showed are available for free online. PCIC has a suite of tools. CCCS just presented on theirs, and Prairie Climate Center has some as well. So if you have a project that could use climate data, or you're just curious about climate projections for your region, please do feel free to reach out to me. This is my email, or you can send me a message in the chat, whichever works best for you. And thank you again.
Thanks so much, Nina, for your presentation. It was very informative and interesting. And now I will pass it over to Gu and Carmichael. We did have a few technical difficulties, but Carmichael was able to join by phone, and Gu will share the slides. So Gu and Carmichael are from the First Nations Emergency Services Society, or FNESS. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
Hi, everybody. My name is Carmichael Howes. I am a spatial data analyst at FNESS. I'm calling right now from the Lekwungen and WSÁNEĆ traditional territories, and excited to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm Gu. I work and live from the unceded and traditional territory of Musqueam people. Thank you for having me here.
Awesome. So we're going to be doing a presentation today about some of the climate change impacts and challenges we've found working at First Nations Emergency Services, and some adaptation opportunities that are in place. So as the previous two presentations alluded to, with an increase in temperature means we will have an increase in wildfire intensity and frequency. This has been seen over the past 5 or 10 years. We've had many of the worst wildfire years on record within the last 10 years. So a little bit, foreboding on the horizon, but not to say there aren't solutions in place or things we can do. So generally as well, First Nations are more often impacted by wildfires because of the remoteness of many communities, compared to where many settler towns have been placed. Could you go to the next one, please? Thank you. One thing that we saw in the atmospheric river of 2021 was the relationship between wildfire and flooding. So as you saw in the previous picture, and actually, could you just hop back for a second to that previous slide? This is a rank 6 wildfire. You're seeing a couple of things here. One of the things Guyu just kind of showed with his cursor there, that is a mixture of sediment, ash, and water. So when the fire burns this hot, it causes the water to be repelled from the surface. Why is that significant, and kind of how does that impact flooding? Well, this wildfire we were looking at just there is the Lytton Creek wildfire. Roughly, the area that covered was about 40 kilometers by 50 kilometers. And a lot of it was a pretty high severity, which means, when an atmospheric river comes in a couple months later, the water isn't able to be absorbed into the landscape the way it normally is. And as you can see there, the river has a bunch of little trees. They help absorb the water. They also help retain that and slowly let it back out over time. So the unfortunate issue is that when we have, exactly as Guyu just showed, kind of the before and after of the hydrophobic soils, one thing that can happen when we get unprecedented atmospheric rivers is a lot of erosion in this case. But yeah, in general, there is, unfortunately, that kind of relation. And part of being prepared, which is a lot of what we work on at FNESS, as opposed to the kind of response perspective. It was found in, I believe it's the Abbott-Chapman report after the 2017 wildfires, that for every dollar that is spent on preparedness, you would end up spending $6 on response. So the cost of not putting any preventative measures in place is sixfold putting measures in place preemptively. So that's you know, an unfortunate kind of outcome of this scenario, but we have some solutions in place, which is awesome to kind of take a look at. Guyu, if you could hop to the next slide, that'd be fantastic. And take it away whenever you want, Guyu. Oh yeah, there you go. Sorry, I was gonna hop on the last one. So as we know, remote locations are often more susceptible to wildfire and flooding. And in general, these areas, as Nina alluded to, we're gonna have parts of the province that warm faster than others, and we're gonna have parts of the province that have had maybe a different kind of scenario. I find often when we talk about climate change, what comes to mind is that it's gonna get warmer. The definition of climate is the weather observations in one location over a 30-year period. So in scenarios where it's not just going to get warmer, maybe you get more snowfall. I know post-atmospheric river, we were responding to a couple nations on the island where they had record snowfall that sheared beams of ceilings in half because of the weight of the snow on those roofs. That's never happened before. And you know, there's not an expectation of having that kind of snow clearing material in place. So it's not to say that it's all going to be wildfire or it's all going to be flooding. Unfortunately, it's going to be dynamic. Guyu, please take it away.
Yeah. So here are some of the adaptation and resiliency building opportunities we can have. We can do field mitigation, riverbank stabilizations, and maybe we just make evacuation plans. On the image we see here are the increment Indian band. We spent about 10 years doing field mitigation around the reserve. So when there was a wildfire, we can see the treatments we did here have actually protected the safety of community infrastructures. And to make the best adaptation planning for our community, we would like to use the projected data to determine the priorities, what are the most urgent problems, and how are we gonna address them. Here's a screenshot of our web map showing how temperature will change in Kamloops in the future. Under the worst case scenario, you can see about 5 degrees increase here. Let's not go there. We made this data available to all reserves in BC. So more on this at our next workshop in May. We would also want to incorporate traditional knowledge in the planning process. People who live on land for their whole life will definitely know things better than me just looking at numbers on my laptop. But the numbers still are helpful though. Let's document the information. Where was the stone line at 30 years ago, or even 200 years ago? How often was the land flooded when you were a child? How did the animals behave in the past? When did the geese left and when they come back? Those things like this are worth writing down for future reference to identify the change and trend. So integrating both traditional knowledge and Western science is going to be very beneficial to find community-focused solutions to build climate change resiliency. That's just dealing with the consequences. First Nations in BC can also be leaders in mitigating climate change. So here I'm gonna highlight some of the indigenous leadership in climate change. We know that a great example is the Great Bear Rainforest Project. This is an indigenous-led project. It not only sequesters carbon, mitigates global warming, it also protects ecosystem, protects culturally significant lands. And from selling carbon credits, communities also benefit from, also gets increased revenue. There's also even a law named after the Great Bear Rainforest. A project like this can need a lot of resources and expertise to implement, and it can be difficult for small organizations. So let's just work together, work with your neighboring nations, work with universities, work with nonprofits like us, like FNESS. It is possible for us to make something equally successful like this. Apart from the coastal First Nations, there's also the Canada-wide Indigenous Clean Energy Network. There's also the BC First Nation Energy and Mining Council. So yeah, if we think the province or the federal government is not doing enough, let's be vocal and push for the change we want to see. Lastly, I also want to mention that there are more climate-related funding opportunities out there. An example is last year's and earlier this year's climate risk, disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation funding. Our team members have supported over 20 applications. Yeah, we are building our capacity and we are willing to help nations with more future funding opportunities. Thank you for listening to our presentation. I will share the contact information in the chat, and we are happy to answer questions later.
Thanks so much, Guyu and Carmichael. Great presentation. And now I will hand it over to Cynthia Fell from the NEN department, or the Land and Resource Department of the Tŝilhqot'in National Government.
Thanks, Christy.
Oh, Guyu, your screen's still being...
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Okay. Can you see my screen now? Good?
It's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just put myself over here. Okay, so today I'm going to share briefly an overview of some work we were doing for the Tŝilhqot'in Nation. I am honored to live and work in the territories of the Tŝilhqot'in and the Tŝilhqot'in First Nations in Williams Lake and in the territory west of Williams Lake. We worked on a project with our NEN department at TNG and collaborate with the 6 Tŝilhqot'in communities to analyze how climate change is impacting culture of food security. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that this project was made possible by funding from the First Nations Health Authority, and our project team was supported by the expertise of ESSA Technology Incorporated and Moccasin Flower Consulting. Additionally, we had data provided by Dr. Tonley Wang, Associate Professor of the Department of Forest and Conservation Science and Associate Director for the Center for Forest Conservation Genetics at UBC. And the data that he shared with us is not publicly available, but I will acknowledge that he shared it and it will be available at some point in the future. So before I begin, I'll give a little bit of background on the Tŝilhqot'in Nation. The nation's territory covers a large area in central BC, extending from the Coast Mountains across the Tŝilhqot'in Plateau to the Fraser River. The nation is made up of 6 member communities: Tŝilhqot'in, Niinatsit'in, Klesko, Glutinko, Saideldel, and Estila. And in 2014, the Tŝilhqot'in Nation secured Canada's first and only declaration of Aboriginal title land, approximately 2,000 square kilometers of Tŝilhqot'in territory. And that land wraps around Tŝilhqot'in Lake, the headwaters of the Fraser River, and habitat of the sockeye salmon, an important traditional food source for the nation. So in order to understand how climate change will impact food security, you must first understand what food security is. And it can be defined as access to preferred nutritious food that meets the dietary requirements for a healthy and active lifestyle. And the 4 pillars of food security include availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability. For the Tŝilhqot'in Nation, food security includes the ability to harvest wild animals, primarily resident fish and anadromous salmon and ungulate, such as moose and deer, the ability to harvest wild plants for sustenance and medicine, and grow the ability to grow agricultural crops and raise domestic livestock. A second here. Climate influences where and how many wild foods occur on the land and in the water. So we're at an important place in time where Tŝilhqot'in food security is being threatened by climate change, but climate change is not the only factor affecting food security. Natural resource operations such as forestry, mining, and agriculture are all impacting food security for the nation. In particular, access to fishing and hunting grounds and harvesting sites are greatly impacted by road construction, from resource operations, which can increase access, or by access restrictions associated with land use activities. So for this project, we're going to focus in on the climate influences. In June of 2021, TNG commenced this project to develop a climate health action strategy. The project activities included gathering Indigenous knowledge by conducting surveys, hosting meetings, conducting interviews to understand the nation's food security priorities and climate concerns. We reviewed literature and are continually learning about climate change and the interconnectivity between climatic conditions and wild foods. That information gathering included reading internal reports, external reports, and scientific papers. Based on the food security priorities and climate impact concerns, we conducted a risk assessment, and we focused on analyzing how changing climatic conditions have the potential to impact the nation's food security. For example, we considered the risk associated with heat stress, seasonal water scarcity, flooding. There are a number of annual and seasonal climatic variables that can be modeled spatially. So using those scientific models, ESSA technology provided the spatial changes for a number of those variables. So we focus on answering a few questions. How much are these variables predicted to change? Where are the variables changing? And where are the variables remaining relatively stable? I'm not going to present the climate data maps to you, but I will give a little background. For example, changes in summer maximum temperatures were projected to be greatest at the higher elevation coast mountain habitat in the territory. And winter precipitation is projected to increase in the coast mountains as that coastal climatic conditions move further into the interior. So these are all relevant to the territory. Each community in BC will have different impacts, as noted by other presenters here today. But in many areas of the territory, we see an annual moisture deficit. So this refers to drying. The annual moisture deficit is essentially evaporation off the land and transpiration out of plants and trees. The moisture evaporating out of plants exceeds precipitation, so a drying effect. So even though we have more precipitation in the winter in areas, we also see drying across the landscape. So that variability in the climatic conditions is changing. So using the available data sets, we have now compiled spatial data sets that we can use to further analyze and inform high-level land use plans and long-term management plans, and support food security strategies and emergency management plans. We collaborated with our fisheries and wildlife staff. We discussed ways in which climate modeling could support the management for salmon populations, because salmon are such an important food source for the Tŝilhqot'in. The evaluations of impacts of climate change on salmon is extremely complex. We have ocean survival, which can be impacted by high water temperatures. Freshwater survival can also be impacted by the water temperatures and oxygen levels. Those oxygen levels decrease as water temperatures increase. The amount of water in freshwater systems and those water fluctuations can impact the survival of developing eggs, rearing juveniles, and migrating adult salmon. Water levels can affect the upstream migration as the salmon return, and those fluctuations can result in fish stranding on the riverbanks if those are fluctuating when they're spawning, or even juveniles can get stranded. So currently there are gaps in available data to support a thorough evaluation of the climate impacts on salmon in the territory. So those evaluations were not thoroughly assessed in the project. The Tŝilhqot'in Nation is working to fill those data gaps, particularly with the nation's water monitoring program. So after expanding our understanding about climate data and reviewing modeling tools and assessing the utility of the data available to support our assessments, we decided to focus on spatial modeling for culturally important plants, habitat, and ecosystems, focusing on terrestrial management planning as opposed to that aquatic ecosystem management specifically. But how we manage the land can greatly impact aquatic habitats. So we take that holistic approach as we're thinking about that ecosystem connectivity. We focus efforts on evaluating the potential ecosystem changes and changes to suitable site conditions. And I'll show you those models outputs in the next few slides. The other activities that were part of this project were community engagement and developing educational material. So we developed education material, and then we went out in the schools and presented with the Tŝilhqot'in Rangers and just engaging youth and elders and knowledge holders and getting that important feedback from community members and sharing the outputs of this work. So before I talk about the model outputs, I'm going to talk a little bit about models. The models allow us to put together our best understanding of complex real-world systems in a simplified way, and they help us explain ideas and describe a range of possible outcomes and compare different scenarios, but there are always limitations. These are always approximations. They're only as good as the data that go into them, and they can be misinterpretive if assumptions are not clear. So we must validate that we have confidence in those models. Going out, following up to say, are these changes that we're predicting, are we observing them? That's the validation process. The RCPs, these are the representative concentration pathways. This was spoken a bit earlier in this webinar, but I wanted to share this information. This is a valuable infographic that explains what representative concentration pathways are. And what I will note is that right now our trajectory is on the RCP 8.5. That's the trajectory we're currently on. And that shows that's a high emission scenario. We use those high emission scenarios to look at different climate variables, but the modeling also focused on the 4.5 RCP scenario. So moderate emission scenario. I'm not going to go into much more detail than that. You can follow up on this slide afterwards and read more about that if you like. But for the other modeling we did, we looked at biogeoclimatic ecosystems and plant distribution modeling. We used that 4.5 scenario, so a moderate emissions scenario, assuming globally there will be a reduction in emissions by mid-century. So this is a possible outcome. The biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification system has been developed for all of British Columbia, and it maps out ecologically similar sites based on climate, soils, and vegetation. So as I said, this data is the data that came from Dr. Tonley Wang, and it will become available on Climate BC's webpage at some point in the future. And what this data shows us is how these different biogeoclimatic zones are projected to change. So this is the current area. This is the Nankai-Dani Accord boundary, the Tŝilhqot'in territory. In this, we see these blue areas are subboreal spruce and pine spruce ecosystems. This orange area here, is interior Douglas fir. That pink section there, again, those spruce forests. What we see over time from these scenarios is the general long-term trends indicate an expansion of grasslands. So we see the red is the bunch grass. We can see them expanding over time. I'm just going to toggle back and forth through here as I explain this. We also see a transition from that subboreal pine spruce to interior Douglas fir, and then transitioning into some ponderosa pine forests as well over the long term. We also see the coastal ecosystem transitioning towards the interior, and trees in higher elevations in the mountains with the loss of that alpine tundra. So we can see the ecosystems are shifting, and those are the general trends. But what does this mean? So ESSA conducted a change detection mapping to identify areas where the Tŝilhqot'in territory are predicted to have large changes, and areas where less changes are expected. The changing distribution patterns of ecosystem highlights two notable areas of refuge and areas of impact. And these can be used to support resource management and long-term food security decision-making. So those areas of climate refuge are ecosystems where change is least expected, which would continue to support existing conditions for suitable habitat. And then the areas of climate impact are ecosystems where change is expected to be greatest. And you can think about managing these in a way. In the areas of refuge, we can protect values in those ecosystems, monitor the species population, the genetic diversity, and those in those areas of impact, we can look at restoration efforts and inform management of existing populations, how we manage those areas, thinking about long-term, what trees will grow there, what habitat will exist for wildlife, what values will there be for cultural activities, food, and for food security. So you can see here, the highest degree of changes are predicted in red, and lowest degree of change you can see are mapped out in green here. So you can see the red areas in that high elevation areas where the coastal conditions are coming in, and then red here where those spruce forests are changing more. You see a degree of change across the whole territory. There's some green pockets as well. So thinking about those areas is what are the values that we would want to protect in those areas? So to further evaluate climate impacts on the landscape, we focused on specific plant species. So ESSA worked to model suitable site conditions for a number of culturally important plants for the Tŝilhqot'in Nation. And in order to do that, we needed data points. So location observations were needed, and we used publicly available data sets. So this data came from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And in order to bolster our projections, to make them stronger, we can incorporate Tŝilhqot'in data, but that wasn't done at this time. This is where we've got to at this point. So the location information that were publicly available were then combined alongside with environmental data that described the conditions that those plants were growing in. And then we used those variables, annual temperature, humidity, elevation, or some of those, to predict where they could currently grow, and then where they might grow in mid-century and then late century, in the midterm and the long term. So additional work is necessary to validate the projected distribution patterns of these plants. And this tool can be improved by incorporating local knowledge, collecting additional data, and increasing monitoring efforts. So I'll show you the maps for Labrador tea, which in Tŝilhqot'in is Bajisiarian, which can be interpreted to mean what caribou eats. So when we think of these culturally important plants, it's not just about the importance for the Tŝilhqot'in people, but these plants also have these important values for wildlife and habitat and ecosystem biodiversity. So this current map projection shows suitable sites. I'm not saying all these green areas, there's Labrador tea. We're saying from this model, it predicts that these sites could be suitable for Labrador tea. And we know Labrador tea grows in spruce forests, and this aligns with those BEC projections. So over time, we see a reduction in those suitable sites. And this makes sense because we know that this is a plant that likes the moisture. So sharing these two maps today, looking at the BEC zones and Labrador tea, we can see there's suitable sites in those areas that may be more stable, that we may be able to think about how those Labrador tea is managed. So we've done this for about 6 different plants. So this information, we can think about long-term management and focus efforts on gathering additional data to identify areas that can be protected and managed to ensure that the areas can continue to produce Labrador tea for future generations, support cultural practices, and provide those valuable habitat attributes. So in TNG's Climate Health Action Strategy, we have additional data collection and nation-led monitoring. The Tŝilhqot'in Nation's Stewardship Department and the Tŝilhqot'in Rangers do an amazing job monitoring water quality and quantity, assessing species abundance trends and distribution patterns, and are working to fill those data gaps that exist in the federal and provincial data set. Modeling work that we have done here can be used to inform adaptation planning. The 6 Tŝilhqot'in communities are all working to develop NEN, land use plans, and emergency management plan, and this information is being used to ensure that those plans are informed by climate projections. We routinely engage with the nation members and community government staff to share information and ensure adequate opportunities to gather feedback, share project outcomes, and meet with knowledge holders and elders. Collaboration with other nations, governments, universities, and external experts ensures that the Tŝilhqot'in Nation has the information required to support sustainable resource management practices and the long-term goals and objectives of the nation. And with that, I just want to say Tšilhqot'in again to everyone for inviting me to come and share today, and then to the First Nations Health Authority for the funding that was provided for this project, and for all the people that supported on this, our project team, and the individuals who shared knowledge and information to support this work, including ESSA, Moccasin Flower Consulting, and Dr. Ton Lee Wang.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. What an interesting presentation. I just want to thank all of the presenters today and the speakers. We really appreciate your contributions, and we are a little bit behind schedule, so I'd like to open it up to questions, discussion. There was some very interesting comments in the chat. I welcome you to ask your questions to the presenters. Please raise your hands. Oh, I see Patrick Scott is, yeah, please share, Patrick, or raise your hand, put your question in the chat, or please jump in. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks all. So the optimism I have for the next 100 years has been dimmed a little bit. Just so thank you all very much. And I'm going to make it worse. One of my concerns is that we're being very conservative on the impacts because of the cascading effect and tipping points comment. So I don't think we have as much time as we see here. And I'm thinking we're going to be trending toward the higher risk scenarios and higher impact scenarios. So even though I talk about, a stitch in time saves 9, those who prepare for winter survive the winter and all that kind of crap, I want you guys to understand there is an element of urgency that we've just sat on our asses since 1988. So how do we make sure that people understand that, this is the forecasting? So we saw the national, we saw the BC, we saw the impacts that are occurring on the ground. As you know, I'm from Lytton. So I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that we continue to communicate that there's still a lot of hope, there's still a lot of opportunity. We'll continue to advocate for the funding that helps us invest in those preventative mechanisms. As I like to say, we can't control the weather, but we can mitigate its impacts. Secondly, I wanted to point out that I was just at this event called PIVC. It's the worst acronym in the history of events. So is Patricia. One thing I mentioned, though, is that in order to have forecasting, we need site-specific data that's accurate. In Lytton, the temperature was showing 49.6, but there's at least 1,500 other thermometers were showing it at 55 plus. So we need to understand here is that we need site-specific data for forecasting and to prove and start helping us out. So try to get more information on site-specific, regional. Lytton has one weather station. Where's the next one? So why couldn't we put in weather stations in all First Nations communities throughout BC so that our scientists and our experts have empirical defensible data that will help? So I'll just throw that out there that I think some of our infrastructure is a little dated. I don't know when the Lytton weather station was built, but to be 6 degrees out on June 29th and 30th, that's a little unacceptable. So I'll just leave it at that and keep up the good work.
I'm not sure if anyone would like to respond to Patrick's comments. Anything to add? Some very important points. No takers? Was there any other questions, comments from anyone else? We did have a comment in the chat about hemp being used for carbon storage or sequestration to rejuvenate soils after fire. I don't know, that was from Corey Brewer. I'm not sure if anyone had any comments regarding that.
Yeah, I'll comment on that if that's all right.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Corey.
So just as we've been going on here, I've been kind of wondering why the use of hemp or the hemp plant hasn't been used more often as a carbon storage tool, because 1 hectare of hemp can store anywhere up to 20 tons of carbon. And when we turn this into a biochar and maybe perhaps retill it into the ground or into the soils, it's a great source of rejuvenation for soils and waterways. So just, I guess, keeping in mind that hemp is a wonderful tool that can be used to benefit climate change and Mother Earth. It's time to take things like this seriously, because I don't know where it sits with people and the stigma or whatnot, but when we have a tool that can do nations have the ability to utilize hemp in a way that nobody else has. So yeah, just putting it out there that I see it as a wonderful tool to help better and help work with Mother Earth than against. So from timber that is unusable after a fire goes through it. So that's something that we could probably help and talk to other nations with as well, those who are interested. And it sounds like there are a few other nations that are.
Thanks so much, Corey. I'm not sure if anyone wanted to comment, any responses. Or sorry, someone speak up.
Oh, sorry, maybe I'll comment quickly just because I messaged
Absolutely.
Corey privately in the chat about it. But one of our employees at FNESS, our fire services manager, Nate Combs, recently went down to Colorado for his band up in the Gitsan area to basically look at how to use hemp more proactively in building construction. Needless to say, they're putting together a strategy where they'll be able to produce, refine, grow, and process hemp on reserve to make like Lego style hemp blocks, where they'll be able to basically use these hemp concrete blocks to build homes and replace things like that on reserve for a much cheaper fraction of the cost. So some really interesting work with some of those communities. People are interested, I'd be more than happy to connect you in with Nate on our team as well to talk a bit about the process. And one other thing that Patrick Michelle had mentioned, and thanks for your wisdom, Patrick, it's always appreciated. One of the things that FNESS has put together to help communities with this recently is a disaster risk resiliency climate adaptation support mechanism. So if communities are interested in getting funding for climate adaptation assessments or structural mitigations, definitely get in contact with us. You put Casey LaRochelle's email in the chat earlier, and we can put it in again in a minute. But he can help communities get connected with the engineers and the teams that they would need to get a multi-million-dollar application in to deal with some of these impacts and identify them now. So I thought I'd just add those two comments, but thanks everyone. I mean, fantastic presentations today. We learned a lot.
Where is that?
Wonderful, Brendan. Hi, Cindy. Did you have anything to add, or anyone else? Probably just one final comment. We're running out of time already. Anyone? Nope. If not, I want to thank everybody for their contributions, for joining, and I want to pass. Oh, sorry, Daniel. I see your hand up. My apologies.
No, I was just wondering, is this going to be any kind of direction or actionables for BCAFN, our discussions, like what Patrick Michelle discussed, or a few other people? Will these be actionables, or where is this information going? Who's going to be acting on anything that we discuss here?
What I can say is that, yeah, we definitely receive our mandate from chiefs and assembly, but obviously take into consideration the comments from the nations and from rates and title holders. I see Patricia's got her hand up, so I'll pass it to her to make a comment.
Thanks, Christy, and hi, everyone. I'm Patricia Rojas, the Regional Climate Change Coordinator for the BC Assembly First Nations. And yeah, I just want to comment on Daniel's comment. Yeah, BCFN is hosting those webinars, I think since 2 or 3 years ago, and the idea is the goal of those webinars to support First Nations communities, governments, members, to do their own climate action activities in different ways. And one is gathering information to see how we can advocate for changes and which other projects we can bring to the communities as well. So yes, we are taking notes of the webinar, and we'll see how we can support the nations. And if there is a very specific action, we are here to help you. So we are taking notes, and the HAMP, I think it's very important. And also the presentations we just hear, I think there are many actions actually coming from there. We also have our First Nations Climate Strategy and Action Plan that was endorsed by Chiefs in Assembly last year. And the implementation of the strategy includes some actions that are related to this topic as well. So yeah, if you have more ideas, please don't be afraid to contact us, Christy or myself, and we can plan whatever you need. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Now we have been mindful of time. We only have a few minutes left. I'd like to pass it off to retired chief Harvey McLeod for a couple final comments, and then right after Harvey's done, he'll pass it off to Patricia just for a couple next steps and final closing words. So thanks to everybody.
Again, just thanking everybody for taking time out of their busy day to join us. There's so much that we need to know and understand in here, and learn from what others are doing, or having a better understanding of where we're at. For example, so much to understand here in community. In the Nicola Valley, we probably have some of the best grasslands in the country, probably in the world, and we don't look at it as a part of our environment that can take care of us. We released some burrowing owls on last Saturday, and we're talking about how beautiful this is and how we have to see our land differently than we have in the past. It's not only for cows and horses. It's not only for the mowich or the moose or the bear. It's also, for us to help maintain and bring a healthy balance to where we live, have a better understanding of what that is, and having discussions so that we can engage not only as political, but as people, the people doing the work. And that's where the big difference is going to come from. And I really thank the presenters today for bringing insight, talking about the science behind what's happening. And at the same time, we can bring that back to our people, our community, and say, this is what they're talking about. You may understand, but you have an understanding about what's going on. Let's have some discussions about that. So I really thank everybody for taking the time out today to join us. And White Lebanon, thank you.
Thank you so much, Harvey. Appreciate you being here today and your words. So I will pass it on to my colleague Patricia Rojas to just make a few final comments to close the webinar in a good way too.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the attendees, and thank you, the presenters, for sharing all the work you are doing. Thank you, former Chief Harvey, for your words, and also former Chief Patrick for all your wisdom as well. So our next steps is this webinar, the one we just had, is part of a series of workshops, actually 3 workshops in total, or one webinar, 2 workshops. And on the screen, you can see the next workshops that we are hosting with FNESS. And on May 30 at 10 a.m. is the first workshop. This is part 1, how to access and interpret First Nations research specific climate data. And FNESS will be leading this session, and they will present what the work they are doing and how to use this data in specific issues in reserves. So the next workshop will be held in June 20, also from 10 to 11:30. And this is about environmental footprint tracking and reporting tools that FNESS will also share with us. So I invite you to attend those workshops and also to share that information with your networks or with whoever wants to join to these events. And here is also all our presenters, their information, their emails. Please feel free to reach out to them if you have more questions, and also, as I said, to BCFN and FNESS if you have any comment or further questions. So would you like to see even a webinar on a different topic? We can also help you to host that. And just the last thing is we will be hosting some engagement sessions during this year to co-develop or to facilitate the co-development of the First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda. That is an initiative that is coming with the federal government, and the idea with this initiative is how to change this model of funding First Nations communities. We hear here and seen the comments that nations need funding support, and the idea with this climate leadership agenda is discussing the way how we can change those and other things as well. But that's one of the main topics that we will be coming to the nations to discuss those important issues. So thank you very much again, and I hope see you in the next webinar or the next workshop.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.